and welcome to Africa Speaks live on Pan-African television. We are broadcasting live via satellites across from 46 African countries and some parts of Europe and South America. I'm your host, Victoria Wilson, and I'm glad to be bringing you this week's edition of Africa Speaks. This week, we mark Africa Liberation Day, a day observed every 25th of May, a day born of struggle, a day that reminds us that our freedoms were not handed down, they were fought for. But here's the question we sit with today. Is Africa truly liberated? The struggle continues. And as we mark this day, we remember Africa did not walk down this road alone. Stay with us as we delve deep inside this. And now let's begin with our spotlight segment with Daniel Tuasante. When we speak of Africa liberation, we cannot talk only of African hands. Few stood with us as firmly as Cuba. From Angola to Guinea-Bissau, from Algeria to the fight against apartheid, Cuban internationalists shed their blood on African soil, not for conquest, but for solidarity. So what does this history teach us today? Let's get talking.
Today on Spotlight, we reflect on African Liberation Day, a moment not only to celebrate Africa's freedom struggle, but also to honor the international solidarity that helped defeat colonialism, imperialism, and apartheid on the continent. One nation whose contribution remains largely ignored in the mainstream history is Cuba. Though small in size and under economic blockade for decades, socialist Cuba stood firm with African liberation movement at a time many powerful Western nations either supported colonial regimes or remained silent. From Algeria and Guinea-Bissau to Angola, Namibia and South Africa, Cuba provided military assistance, doctors, teachers, and political support to African liberation struggle. In 1975, when apartheid South Africa invaded Angola to crush the newly independent MPLA government, Cuba sent thousands of volunteer soldiers under what became known as Operation Carlota. For socialists and Pan-Africanists, Cuba intervention represented revolutionary internationalism, the belief that the oppressed people must unite across borders against colonial domination and capitalist exploitation. Unlike Western powers that often intervene for profit, mineral control, or geopolitical influence, Cuba claimed no African land, demanded no resources, and established no cooperation in return for its support. The decisive Battle of Gueto Guanali in Angola became the turning point in struggle against apartheid. Cuban, Angolan, and Namibian forces defeated the South African army, weakening apartheid rule and accelerating Namibia's independence and South Africa's liberation struggle. Nelson Mandela later praised Cuba, saying the Cuban people holds a special place in the hearts of the people of Africa. Mandela described Cuba's contribution as unparalleled in its selflessness and solidarity. To many socialists, Cuba's role in Africa proved that international solidarity could challenge imperialism and racial oppression. Even after the war, Cuba continued sending doctors, engineers, and teachers across Africa, reinforcing the idea that liberation is not only political, but also social and economic. As Africa marks Liberation Day, the story of Cuba reminds the continent that freedom was never won alone. It was built through unity, sacrifice, and resistance against system of exploitation. And perhaps the lesson remains relevant today, that Africa's true liberation will only be complete when economic independence, social justice, and continental solidarity become realities for the ordinary African people. For Africa Speaks, this has been the Spotlight, and I'm Danny Otuesante. Over to you, Victoria.
And now to help us make sense of this rich and often undertold history, we are joined by Comrade Jesus, a voice with deep insight into the bonds between Cuba and African liberation movement. What did Cuba's solidarity truly cost? And what does Africa owe Cuba today as it endures the longest blockade in modern history? Let's hear it. A very good evening to you, Comrade Jesus, and thank you so much for joining us today on Africa Speak Show. We are looking at the African liberation movement, and we know the role that Cuba has played in the movement in liberating Africa. So, can you tell us that about Cuba's revolutionary journey since 1959, whether it is deeply linked to the struggle for liberation in the African continent? Can you tell us a bit about this deep bond that existed and why were these struggles in Africa that were so far away important for the people of Cuba?
Yes, good afternoon, and thank you very much for this opportunity. Um, I would like to say, first of all, that Cuba is a nation that was formed by the heritage of Africa. I mean, it's a nation was formed by thousands and a high percentage of African people. They
Right.
were forcibly brought to Cuba as a slave
Mm-hmm.
in the 16th century, but they were integrated to our nations and they were making a great contribution to our struggles of independence in the 19th century. Many generals of our wars, independence wars, are descendants of African people. And the slaves that finally get the liberation and the struggles independence of Cuba became Cuban and their families stayed there. So we are talking about the great heritage culture that we have from Africa, and of course, ethnically, socially, culturally, and in a family way, we have a great link with African people. We are
Mm.
probably descendant of Africa. So we are in this journey for many, many years. At the end, we are family, and family, in family within bonds in the family is impossible to disregard it and ignore.
Exactly. Okay, you talking about us being family and the fact that our struggles are interconnected. Can you tell us a bit about the diverse ways in which this relationship between Cuba and African liberation movement grew from military to other spheres of internationalism and solidarity? Because we know that Cubans did not just send troops to fight the wars in Namibia, in Angola, and the rest. They also sent doctors, they sent teachers, they sent engineers, and all that. So, can you tell us about this relationship and how that relationship grew from just military to other spheres of internationalism and solidarity?
Well, first of all, probably there is not many people who knows that the first international um, aid that Cuba provides to Africa was not military. Was
Oh,
also in 1963,
mm,
uh, more than 60 doctors of Cuba arrived to Algeria
mm,
in order to provide assistance for that people and to help that people about some diseases that were suffering. We had
right,
the sources enough, in spite of the Cuban Revolution was so young, we sent a group of Cuban doctors in 1963. And
mm,
that was the first internationalist aid that Cuba provides to Africa, not military. On the other hand, in the 60s, also, this movement for decolonization in Africa was supported by Cuba. Cuba is a socialist country. That means that by principle, we are fighting any type of against injustice, against imperialism, against colonialism. So for all this a moral duty and a moral commitment to support the movement of Africa who are in favor of decolonization, who are in favor of liberating from imperialism, who are in favor to free the women and men that were part of our nation at the end, the heritage cultures that we have. So by principle, a socialist country has to be always present
right,
in the board of all the movement who are looking for freedom, looking for decolonization,
mm,
looking for liberation, and also we were contributing the African people, the African countries, not only with a military presence, that by the way was an asking of the government, was not something that Cuba made by itself.
right,
Um, the countries of Africa has been receiving a contribution of Cuban revolution in thousands of doctors, engineers, teachers, agronomists across all the continent. They were providing knowledges and preparation for those people in Africa. And also, you have to understand that for us, and we understand that very well. Education is a very powerful weapon in order to decolonize a country. So
Right.
we not only contribute with that support in the persons and soldiers in this moment as internationalist present, but our internationalism was expressed to in sending teachers, engineers, doctors, people who were electricians, every kind of job to help African people to liberate themselves for colonialism.
I get you. I want us to stay a bit more on that particular question, the help of Cuba, not just militarily, but also in other spheres. What do you think was the rationale behind this? The rationale behind helping Africans in fighting for liberation, not just to liberate themselves from the armed, like an armed struggle, but also liberate themselves mentally, just as in and also equip them with the skills. What did you think was the rationale? What was Fidel trying to achieve by sending technical people to Africa to help build Africa and not just send troops to fight?
Well, first of all, our help to Africa, as I told you before, is a help that we are providing to the family. We are providing that help without taking back resources or the richness of Africa had. The
Right.
only objective, the only goal that we have is, as a socialist country, contribute to the liberation of every man and women in
Mm,
this continent, particularly when all the superpower was trying to extract the resources of Africa. We were providing resources of education
mm,
and culture, resources for people liberating self. Colonialism is a real problem, not because the people are just taking your land, is because you can be liberated and expel all the colonialists from your homeland, but you can also expel the colonialism from your mind.
right.
The most important thing is decolonize not just the homeland
Right.
as a territory, physical
Mm,
territory, but decolonize the mind of the people to make a
exactly.
people really free. You have to educate the people and be decolonized. People who consider themselves that they can do it,
Mm,
they not feel that they are diminished in front of the other ones that were colonizing their country. They feel women and men that can do anything with education appropriated and be proud to be African. No, to find a way to be proud of being, Europeans.
right.
Africa have resources enough. Africa have energy enough.
Mhm,
Africa have talent enough to
mhm.
bribe by themselves. And we were contributing to that. Is something like, pay our own debt with the humanity and pay with our own debt with the African countries that many resources bring to Cuba with their presence, with their culture, with their spirit. If we have now resilience and resistance, if we have the resilience enough in order to face every circumstances,
Exactly.
is in part because we are descendants of Africa.
Right. Very good. I think, and also, you know that in relation to this particular help that the Cuban people offered to the African continent, it's because of that they are facing, this blockade. As at this moment, they are facing the brutal blockade that the US and its allies have placed on them. Today, Cuba is being punished for this politics of social solidarity and for representing an alternative to the US imperialism. Can you tell us about the nature of the US attacks and how it is affecting the Cuban people and their daily lives?
It's a very good question. I mean, your question is great because in your question, you have part of the answer. Cuba is being punished for the experience of imperialism, anti-imperialism he have,
Mm-hmm.
and because the solidarity he is spreading around the world. Cuba is punishing because the socialist ideas they have to defend, and because we decided to get the socialist system by ourselves.
Mm-hmm.
No, because the United States government or any other superpower tell us what to do. So the Cuban people decide by themselves that the socialist system was the best in order to leave behind colonialism. The problem is that the United States government decided from the very beginning that Cuba was an example to
Mm,
erase.
right.
Uh, Cuba doesn't have fuel oil. It's not a superpower in fuel oil. neither in diamonds, neither in uranium, neither any other resources. It's not a rich country. It's a small country. It's a nation of peace, but it is a nation that proved that people can raise by themselves. The people can be free without the permission of the United States. The
Mm.
people can, Cuba have demonstrated in all the entire world that you can grow up without the help of the superpower, and even with the blockade, criminal blockade that the United States government is practicing in Cuba for more than 6 decades. So Cuba have shows the solidarity with the African people. We were in a decisive participation in the fight of the apartheid. We were creating our own system of public health to help people of Cuba and to help the people of every country in the world who decided better. We were creating vaccines by ourselves in order to take care of our population. We provide dignity to our people. We made that the Cuban people felt with dignity in every corner in the world. So we made our nation be respected in the United Nations in every international forums. And the United States of America government doesn't like this. They want to erase the example of dignity,
Mm.
resilience, resistance of the Cuban people. And
Mhm.
that's important for you to know that it's not fighting a Cuban government. They're fighting in the entire nation. They are against all the nation of Cuba. The enemy of the nation, the Cuban nation, is the U.S. government.
Mhm.
We can be the difference between uh, U.S. citizens that live in the U.S. and need to be educated to. We consider that the people in the United States, not every people in the United States, is agree with the policy of the government. In fact, there are many people inside the United States who are fighting and express their disagreement with this criminal blockades and the crime in progress that means to deprive and the entire nation of medicines, fuel oil, energy, food, etc. And we talk about not the so-called embargo, as the U.S. government said. We're talking about the blockade because it's affected every nation of the world who dare to make a trade with Cuba, make any agreement with Cuba, including the African countries and the
Mm.
African countries. They are punishing and pursuing anyone in the world who try to have a position of solidarity and make a trade agreement with Cuba because they don't want Cuba be prosperous because that means we can do it without the U.S. government and they cannot allow that. That's the real reason. They are not against the Cuban Revolution because the resources, they are not against the Cuban Revolution because the internationalism is because above all was the example that Cuba needs for more than 6 decades. They need to erase that example. And of course, we never gonna, get back just to satisfy this selfish ambition of the U.S. government.
Right, right. In fact, you are resistant. I know that we all know we've heard the stories that in spite of that criminal blockade, Cuba is standing solidly on their ground and resisting US imperialism. And now let's look at what, the government of Africa and the people of Africa can do
Mhm.
in standing in solidarity with Cuba in this trying times. Is it essential for governments in Africa and the people of Africa to stand in because it was out of the act of Cuba giving themselves out there for the people of Africa that they have been faced with this blockade, they have been hit by this blockade. So what can we do also in return to, uplift the situation that you're going in?
Yes, well, I think to stand with Cuba in this moment um, is to stand on the side of justice.
All right.
Is to stand on the side of defend dignity, is defend the fight against colonialism, the fight in favor of one people that have been always in favor of the justice causes around the world. The African countries and African governments, the African people must understand that the United Nations in the National Assembly have expressed year by year they refuse, they reject the criminal blockade that the United States is attacking Cuba for many years. So that means that to put standing with Cuba, you're standing with the international community who are in favor of leave the blockade, the leave the criminal blockade. It's not just a question to stand with Cuba to satisfy the Cuban interests. It's because the entire world, the entire humanity, just with the exception of the United States government and other allies, a couple of allies, all the entire people who are member of the United Nations and General Assembly every year vote in favor of lifting the blockade. Nevertheless, the United States continues with the same position. So African countries and African people have to understand that the stand with Cuba is a stand on the side of justice. Even the Pope have expressed concern about this policy of the United States towards Cuba, in the Holy See. Just 15 days ago, there was a Holy Mass asking for lifting the blockade, asking for stop this criminal in progress, this crime in progress. That means the reinforcement of the criminal blockade of more than 60 cases, the reinforcement of many other measures, many other sanctions to make possible the people in Cuba get, that suffering and is suffering this situation that we are suffering right now. It's important for you to know and the other African countries that this situation that we are living, the only one responsible for this situation is the U.S. government.
What do you think people's movement in Africa can also do to concretely, contribute to the Cuban resistance to U.S. imperialism?
Well, we are resisting because the unshakable determination of the Cuban people to resist imperialism goes. But of course, we are resistant also because the huge solidarity we are receiving around the world. But the solidarity is not just a romantic gesture. I think the solidarity has to be expressed in fact. So I'm afraid that denouncing every forum this criminal policy of the United States towards the people of Cuba is very important because they are denouncing the criminal measure that they are making to the entire humanity. Remember, we began this interview talking about the family and the bonds we have with the family. So they are offending your family. They are attacking your family. They are trying to exterminate your family. They are committing a genocide against the Cuban people. It's against the family that we have here in Africa. That's exactly what happened when Africa have this Ebola disease, and we felt ourselves that we had the moral duty to help African people to defeat not only colonialism, not only racism and apartheid, but also the disease who can kill a lot of African brothers. So I'm afraid that for the solidarity to be expressed, not just in a romantic gesture. I mean, we appreciate very much all the gesture and all the actions that the African people is doing in this moment, sending medicine, sending food, sending variation of energy, a solar panel. That is very important in order to resist this kind of attacks of imperialism and this severe blockade for more than 60 cases. But also to denounce in every corner, denounce in every forum, denounce in every corner of the city, talk with the students, talk with the most important personalities in Africa. Let them know that the Cuban people, that solidarity people, that people who have living and will live in dignity for all their life is in danger because the U.S. government tries to commit a genocide against the people. Educate the people. Bring this message to every corner of Africa, to every social network. Social networks are very useful weapon for that. And the solidarity, as I told you before, is not just a romantic gesture. Could be a very important weapon, very important political weapon to avoid this kind of crime in progress that the U.S. government tried to provide for this. So I think it's the most important thing. Denounce it, put it in the networks, put it in the TV, educate people, be against this statement of the United States that is telling everyone in the world that they are looking for freedom and democracy in Cuba. Behind that statement is precisely the goals of Conquest Cuba. The last move that they made that is fraudulent, this fraudulent indictment from our general, Raul Castro. There is a former president of Cuba, and by the way, was leading the Army Revolutionary Forces. In the moment that we were fighting together against racism here in Africa, now this movement is fraudulent and is completely unfair and is show the evil purposes of the United States government. They tried to overcome the Cuban Revolution. But let me just to let you know, there is a poem in Cuba. It was made by a poet that was from Mexican origin, but was naturalized in Cuba. His name is Fayad Ramirez. He wrote a beautiful poem entitled For This Freedom. And in this poem, he represents the spirit of the Cuban people, but never gonna kneel to the imperialism. He said, for this freedom, we have to give everything, even the shadow if we need it, and never would be enough. Our natural hero said, who raised with Cuba, and mistaking Cuba is a mistake in all the entire humanity, who raised with Cuba, raised for all the times. So let me finish just with something that is the principle and a firm determination of the Cuban people, precisely in the year of the centenary of the Commander-in-Chief Fidel Castro. Our homeland or death, we shall overcome. We shall win. We shall win, brothers. Thank you.
Exactly. That is very good, comrade. It is important that we note that injustice anywhere is also injustice everywhere. So whatever the Cuban people are facing, it is tantamount that we as progressive, we as Africans, in fact, it was because of us that they are facing this particular blockade. And it's important that we stand with them in solidarity and fight the US narrative and fight the US imperialism. Thank you so much, comrade. We are glad having you. And those were insightful conversations right there. Now, from expert analysis, we move to the voices carrying the work forward. In this segment, we hear from Comrade Albie Walls of the All African Revolutionary People's Party and from Comrade Bajin Zadi. What does liberation mean in this moment, and what does the next chapter demand of us? These are organizers, thinkers, and movement builders. Let's listen to them.
Okay. Yeah, I think it's certainly the situation that Cuba is under right now as a result of, their past history and the relationship with international capital imperialism. The fact that Cuba has fought and defended many countries, particularly and fought to assist in the fight against colonialism, particularly in Africa. And I think, therefore, a lot of places have a lot of respect for what happens in Cuba. So it has a lot more influence than one would think. It's kind of hard and that's, I guess, the influence and the impact is great, even though they're a small territory with a small population. Throughout the continent of Africa, I think Cuba still inspires many of us because we say, well, if you can do what you're doing and resist and fight and still hold on, why can't we do it too? We're not, forced to accept coercion and pressure. We can see what Cuba has been able to achieve even under those kinds of conditions. So I think that's an inspiring thing, I hope, for many of us in the people that we want to lead us as well. I hope that can also add to that confidence and recognition that we don't always have to give in and accept conditions that we know aren't correct. That's the last thing. It kind of surprises me sometimes that I don't know. I haven't lived in the U.S. for a couple of decades now, but I have quite a few contacts there, and it's hard for me to understand how people in the U.S. would even allow a discussion to go on about whether Cuba that Cuba, that actually is based on the threat that Cuba is a threat to the United States in any kind of way, militarily, etc. I think it's amazing to me that I'm not surprised that the leaders don't say anything about it, but the fact that this is just a commonsensical situation that sometimes surprises me, how many people haven't come to not only apparently not understand, but certainly not act to try and stop some of the ridiculous stuff that's going on now in Cuba or against Cuba. So that's my take on the current situation and my hope for a better situation for Cuba in the future.
La journée de la libération de l'Afrique est un sujet très riche, surtout lorsqu'on relie le rôle joué par le Cuba dans la lutte de la libération africaine. Vous savez que le 25 mai, c'est la journée que l'on choisit en référence à la création de l'Organisation de l'Unité africaine en 1963 à Addis Abeba, devenue ensuite l'Union africaine. Cette journée symbolise la lutte entre la colonisation, l'apartheid et toutes les formes de domination étrangère sur le continent. Alors, notre sujet, c'est de parler du lien entre le Cuba et les mouvements de libération africaine. Le rôle de Cuba en Afrique est souvent présenté comme un exemple de solidarité internationale sous la direction de Fidel Castro. Alors, Cuba a soutenu plusieurs mouvements africains qui se battaient pour l'indépendance ou contre des régimes racistes. On peut en donner l'exemple de l'Angola, parce que l'Angola, c'est le soutien le plus marquant. L'exemple le plus connu est celui de l'Angola après l'indépendance du pays en 1975. Une guerre a éclaté. Alors, Cuba est intervenu militairement aux côtés du mouvement indépendantiste MPLA contre les forces soutenues, notamment par le régime d'apartheid sud-africain. Alors, il y a eu en ces temps des dizaines de milliers de soldats cubains ont été envoyés en Angola. Beaucoup considèrent que cette aide a contribué à affaiblir le régime d'apartheid en Afrique du Sud. Il y a eu aussi le combat contre l'apartheid. Le soutien cubain à l'Afrique ne concernait pas seulement les armes, mais Cuba a également soutenu des mouvements anti-apartheid, notamment l'Afrique National Congress de Nelson Mandela. Après cela, Mandela a eu à remercier publiquement Fidel Castro, affirmant que la bataille de Puto Canabal en Angola avait été un tournant dans la lutte contre l'apartheid. Il y a eu la Guinée-Bissau et les colonies portugaises, où Cuba a aussi apporté un soutien au mouvement de libération. Dans des pays colonisés par le Portugal, comme la Guinée-Bissau et le Mozambique, notamment par une aide militaire, médicale et éducative. Il y a eu aussi une solidarité médicale et éducative. Au-delà des guerres, Cuba a envoyé des médecins, enseignants et boursiers dans plusieurs pays. Des milliers d'Africains ont étudié à Cuba, surtout en médecine. Alors, il y a eu l'idée centrale à retenir pour tout ça, c'est quand on parle de la journée de la libération de l'Afrique en lien avec le Cuba, on parle surtout de solidarité internationale dans les luttes anticoloniales. Pour certains Africains, Cuba a été un allié sincère de la libération du continent. Alors, d'autres rappellent aussi que ce soutien s'inscrivait dans le contexte géopolitique de la guerre froide.
And you're still watching Africa Speaks right on Pan-African Television live from our studios at Abelinke 48 Swanika Street. And now to dispatches where we connect the struggles across the continent. From Kenya, we hear from comrades on the latest rise in fuel prices, because liberation is not only about flags and anthems, it is about whether a mother can afford to cook a meal. And from South Africa, Capello reports on the new housing bill before Parliament, a bill that raises old questions about land, dignity, and who the state truly serves. Different countries, one continent, and one struggle. Let's get into that.
Hello comrades, revolutionary greetings. I'd like to pass my regards to all progressive forces, all progressive organizations, all viewers who are joining us today from all parts of the African continent, from all parts of the world as well. My name is Maganga. I'm a member of the Revolutionary Socialist League, which is a party that is based in Kenya. I'd like to also relay our regards on behalf of the RSL to all progressive organizations and forces, as well as to all viewers who are joining us today. Thank you very much. I'd like to today talk about the fuel crisis that is going on in Kenya and the popular resistance that has arisen as a consequence of this crisis. In Kenya, we have a government institution known as EPRA. EPRA is the Energy and Petroleum Regulatory Authority. It is an institution that is mandated to revise and give recommendations for fuel prices on a monthly basis in the country. Last month, EPRA announced a price increase of more than 10 shillings to fuel. So diesel, petrol, kerosene, more than 10 shilling increase. This month, EPRA announced an increase of more than 30 shillings to diesel prices in Kenya. Naturally, this came as a shock to the people of Kenya, who expressed not only dismay but also anger at the audacity of the government to increase the prices of fuel by this extent. As we know, diesel is extremely important to any economy because it is the fuel that primarily is used to power industries, but also because it is the fuel that is mostly used to power buses, vans, and most other public service vehicles. So an increase in the prices of fuel, such as diesel and petrol, would immediately lead to an increase in the prices of basic commodities. The government of Kenya, in trying to justify this sharp increase, said that the prices are increasing because of the ongoing war that the US and Israel are waging on Iran. But of course, the people of Kenya know that in as much as the war against Iran has led to a shock in the supply of petroleum globally, it doesn't justify such a sharp increase in the prices of fuel. In any case, most of the fuel that comes to Kenya, as does the fuel that comes to the rest of East Africa, comes from Saudi Arabia through the Red Sea and not through the Strait of Hormuz. So the increase in the prices of fuel should not go up on such proportions. As a result of this, there have been a series of protests against the increases in the prices of fuel in Kenya. The people have taken to the streets in all urban centers, in all towns, in all counties in Kenya to protest the increases in the prices of fuel. There was a major protest just last week, not only by the ordinary Kenyans, but also by the working class who are engaged in the transport sector. So the truck drivers, the public service vehicle drivers, anyone who was associated with the transport sector, joined the protests in solidarity with Kenyans and in telling the government to lower the prices of fuel. So there's been a series of protests over the past few weeks. The government of Kenya, in response to this, has responded violently. In the protests that took place on Monday last week, there were at least 9 people who died as a result of the violence that the police unleashed upon the people. At least 30 more were injured, and at least 700 were arrested from across the country. So the government has been responding violently to the demands of the people to lower the prices of fuel. In a bid to quell the anger of the people and to restore the normalcy within the economy, the government announced that they were going to reduce the prices of fuel by 10 shillings. This was last week, in order to calm people down. But the people of Kenya know that a decrease by 10 shillings would not be sufficient. It would not even take them to the prices that they were in before April announced an increase in the prices. As a result of this, the popular resistance against the fuel prices goes on. The people of Kenya are saying they are not relenting, and they are continuing with the campaign to ensure that the prices of fuel are dropped. Kenyans know that far from whatever geopolitical issues are going on internationally, there exists a cartel within the fuel industry in Kenya. That cartel deliberately manipulates prices, and of course they have government connections, because many of the people who are part of the cartel are senior officials within the government. Kenyans know that it is this cartel that primarily influences the prices of fuel in Kenya against the wishes of the people. It is said that the president of Kenya himself, William Ruto, owns a stake in an importation company, a fuel importation company known as Gulf Energy, which is primarily the company that handles fuel importations from Saudi Arabia to Kenya. So you can see the conflict of interest. This is why Kenyans are angry. This is why Kenyans are protesting. In this regard, we are urging the people of the world to view this crisis as it really is. Kenya today stands as one of the few countries in Africa with the highest retail prices. The highest retail prices for fuel. So we'd like to urge the people of the world, the progressive organizations, to stand in solidarity with the people of Kenya as they protest, as they resist exploitation, as they demand a smashing of the cartel that is in charge of fuel importation, as they demand an end to all corrupt practices as regards the running of the economy, and specifically the petroleum sector, and as they demand a general drop in the prices of basic commodities in Kenya. I'd like to say that the struggle of the people of Kenya is a mere reflection of the struggles that other people from other parts of the world continue to wage, not only for the decrease in the prices of fuel, but also the prices of basic commodities. I'd like to say that the people of Kenya also extend their solidarity to all the struggles that are taking place in other parts of the world. And in this regard, we would appreciate all forms of solidarity with the protests, with the campaign that is ongoing in Kenya. You're going to see more and more protests in the next few weeks, and depending on how things go, even months. So I'd like to say that we would like to extend our salutations and our call for solidarity to all the people across the world as we continue to resist exploitation and to say that we want a life of dignity.
Yes, thank you very much for the opportunity. The Minister of Human Settlement in South Africa, who comes from the ANC, as you may know, that we have a government of national unity in South Africa, has proposed an amendment to the bill called the Prevention of Illegal Eviction from an unlawful occupier, which is an act that was introduced in 1998, replacing an act that was actually in place, that was an apartheid act, which was called the Prevention of Illegal Squatting, that prevented black people to actually access the cities. This is a piece of legislation that was very progressive, that was protecting the poor and marginalized, replacing an act that was introduced in 1951 by the apartheid government to actually dispossess black people of the land. Now the government of the ANC, working together with the conservative party, political parties such as the Democratic Alliance, which is a right-wing party in South Africa, have come together to actually say that this act does not protect private property owners, and it puts the sole responsibility of finding alternative accommodation to the government. So, Prevention of Illegal Eviction Act of 1998 prevents arbitrary evictions that render people homeless. It was an act that was ensuring that any court must not issue a court order that is evicting poor people without looking at the people's relevant circumstances. In other words, it ensured that no homelessness must take place, but the ANC government is now using that to actually amend it, the power they have in parliament with the GNU, to actually amend this act. One of the proposals is that government should only provide alternative accommodation for a limited time, and also it criminalizes activists like myself and the movement like Abatan Basanjondolo by saying those who are inciting, who are assisting people who are facing eviction will be liable to a fine of 2 million or go to prison for 2 years. So this is reminiscence of the apartheid era. The apartheid era puts people like myself and the movement like ourselves who were banned during the apartheid era and were made, activists were put in prison by the apartheid regime, is exactly what the ANC government is bringing, working together with those who want apartheid to actually return. We are saying, as a matter from John Dodo, the amendment to this act will be committing treason, will be committing, in fact, will be being pro-capital, anti-poor, anti-black, and it will not be a progressive act as it has been. But also, we are saying that as a Bashar Basim John Dolo, we will fight this on the streets, we'll fight this in courts if we have to be, but we'll also go into communities and conscientize our people to say that the ANC government has turned against us. A vehicle that was once a political party that we use to actually fight against the evils of apartheid is today coming together to actually work with our enemies in returning apartheid. And the first step that they are doing now is to amend our progressive constitution so that it favors the rich, it favors the whites and supremacists in our country, and leave the poor and marginalized people like ourselves outside of the economy, ensuring that black people do not get into the cities to work. And it's unfortunate that the cities like Cape Town, like Durban, like Johannesburg were built by poor working class people. And today the ANC, working with the Democratic Alliance and other anti-poor political party in the GNU, is actually driving, passing laws that are going to drive poor black people, particularly the working class in general, Africa in general, in fact, who have suffered a lot during apartheid. We come from a history of dispossession through colonialism. We come from a history of dispossession through apartheid, which introduced what was called the Native Land Act, which ensured that the more than 70% of black people only have access to 13% of the land, and the less than 10% white people still today access more than 70% of the land. So it is unfortunate that the ANC-led government has failed and lacked the political will to address the issue of land, and has resorted to work with our enemies, those who are anti-poor, anti-socialist, to actually introduce legislations that are going to deprive black people who were marginalized during apartheid, during colonialism, who were dispossessed, who were forcefully and brutally have their land taken away from them. Working with them today, the ANC is working with the apartheid apologists to actually bring back apartheid in the form of dispossessing us of the little land that we have, that we've occupied in the cities.
And now let's continue with our Word of the Day segment. This week we are looking at Battle of Ideas, popularized by Fidel Castro. The Battle of Ideas is the understanding that liberation is fought not only with weapons, but it is fought in the mind, in what we read, in what we teach our children, and in what we accept as common sense. To win the Battle of Ideas is to refuse to let the oppressor define our reality. Let's get into that.
This is Africa Speaks on Pan-African TV. I am Rashida Abubakar, and it is time for our Word of the Day segment. Today, we move beyond a single word to focus on an entire political concept that binds continents and struggles, the battle of ideas. Most people believe power lives only in parliaments, armies, or banks, but this power cannot be understood without considering the power of ideas. Long before a system controls your labor, it teaches you what to believe, it teaches you who deserves wealth and who deserves poverty, who should rule and who must remain silent. Exploitation does not survive through force alone. If it did, empires would collapse the moment people outnumbered their rulers. Systems survive because ordinary people are trained to see injustice as normal, to be realistic, and to stop imagining liberation beyond capitalism. The battle of ideas is the struggle over consciousness itself. As we commemorate African Liberation Day, we recognize the unbreakable bond between Africa and Cuba liberation. It was Fidel Castro who formally launched the concept of battle of ideas. Fidel famously declared that ideas are worth more than weapons. He understood that military victory is meaningless if enemy still controls the minds of the people through cultural and psychological warfare. For Fidel, Cuban survival depended on an educated, political, conscious population capable of resisting imperialist propaganda. He applied this directly to Africa. When Cuba stood with African liberation movements in Angola and Namibia, they did not just send troops, they sent teachers, doctors, and books. Fidel knew that true independence requires dismantling the mental scaffolding of colonialism. Today, throughout the world, this battlefield remains unchanged. The battle of ideas is why a child in Africa can name luxury brands, but know little of Patrice Lumumba, Thomas Sankara, or Cuban solidarity. It is why billionaires are celebrated as job creators, while striking workers are called troublemakers. It is why corporate media obsess over broken windows during protests rather than broken systems that caused it. Fidel's vision aligned well with African revolutionary thinkers. Amilcar Cabral knew culture was a weapon against domination. Kwame Nkrumah warned that colonialism would return wearing a suit and carrying contracts instead of rifles. Frantz Fanon exposed how oppression damages the psychology of entire society. Today, across Africa, we debate around debt, foreign military bases, and mineral wealth are not just economic, they are ideological battles too. Even social media algorithms function as imperialist battlefields, rewarding mindless distraction over critical education. Every society is built first through imagination, the dare to dream, and the struggle to new world into reality. Therefore, a different world must be imagined before it can be built. A world where African wealth serves African people, and where healthcare, housing, and dignity are rights, not privileges. Fidel Castro proved that an organized population armed with political consciousness is invincible. I am Rashida Abubakar. Read deeply, question everything, organize consciously, and remember, the moment people begin to think critically, the foundation of exploitation begins to shake. As Sankara said, when the people stand up, imperialism trembles.
And finally, we turn to our history segment today. Not as a memory, but as a guide. African Liberation Day was first observed on 15th April 1958 as the first Conference of Independent African States in Accra, convened by Kwame Nkrumah. It was later moved to 25th May 1963, the day the Organisers of African Unity was founded in Addis Ababa. It was born of one radical idea that Africa's destiny belonged to Africans and that no African is free until all Africans are free. Today, that idea remains as urgent as ever. African Liberation Day is not a commemoration, it is a commitment. Let's understand its deeper meaning. On May 25th, across the continent and the diaspora, we celebrated African Liberation Day, a day that commemorates our sacrifices, our struggles, and our aspirations as we continue the battle for true liberation. The day marks the foundation of the Organization of African Unity in 1963 in the Ethiopian capital of Addis Ababa. The day before, Kwame Nkrumah, addressing his fellow heads of state, stated a simple but powerful truth. The struggle against colonialism does not end with the attainment of national independence. The gathering in 1963 came at a crucial time for the continent. It was the culmination of a long process which included the 5th Pan-African Congress in Manchester in 1945 and the All-African People's Conference in Ghana in 1958. The peoples of the continent were in the process of throwing off centuries of colonial rule. The preceding decades had seen liberation movement work together. In many of the countries that gained independence, revolutionaries joined each other in the trenches, defying the borders imposed on them by colonial powers. From Kenya to the Congo, the struggles were a living embodiment of solidarity. In the aftermath of the countries achieving independence, attempts were made to concretize the idea of Pan-Africanism through initiatives such as the Union of African States between Ghana, Mali, and Guinea. It's been 63 years since that day. today, the continent has changed vastly and the spirit of Pan-Africanism that animated that conference faces fresh challenges today. In these years, Nkrumah's warning has come true in multiple ways. Today, the struggle against colonialism is no longer direct rule. It's no longer the struggle for a flag or an anthem. It is for true sovereignty, for liberation in its comprehensive sense. It is for freedom to utilize each country's resources for the benefit of its own people, for Africans to determine the trajectory of their development, and for societies to free from loot and exploitation. The enemies of African liberation now come in new forms. They are envoys of the IMF and the World Bank who decree how we should structure our budgets. They are military agreements which mandate the deployment of US and French soldiers on our soil. They are giant corporates who leech our resources while we have no say. As capitalism faces a crisis, the West seeks to recolonize Africa. The struggle against this recolonization is being waged in earnest. The Alliance of Sahel States has provided one alternative in the form of a bloc which is redefining what sovereignty looks like. Across the continent, people's movements, trade unions, farmers' organizations, youth uprisings are shaking the foundation of the oppression foisted on us. These patriotic and anti-capitalist waves are the first stage in achieving true liberation. But it is essential to complete this journey. It is essential that the vast majority of the people, the working class and its allies, are mobilized and organized to construct a powerful alternative, a socialist alternative. It is only then that the promise of African Liberation Day will truly be achieved. And that is all for this week's edition of Africa Speaks right here on Pan-African Television, which came to you live from our studios at Abelenke 48, Swanika Street, Accra, Ghana. Today, we mark African Liberation Day, trace the bonds between Africa and Cuba, and heard from organizers on the front lines, traveled from Kenya to South Africa, and reflected on what it truly means to be free. So until next time, keep standing with the people, keep defending the land, and remember, Africa must speak and Africa must be heard. My name is Victoria Wilson. Have a good evening.